Dorothy Arnold was born on July 1st, 1885 in New York City. She was the second child to parents Frances Rose Arnold and Mary Martha Parks Arnold. The Arnold family were known as wealthy for being in the business of good imports like perfume. Dorothy would go to Bryn Mawr College to study literature and language, and she would also be in the graduating class of 1905. After graduating college, she would move back to New York City to pursue a career in writing. Dorothy would try to apply to magazine companies to get her work out into the world. However, she would face rejection. Her rejections caused her friends and family to tease her about not being able to get a job as a writer. Because of this, Dorothy would open a private mailbox for her application results to avoid being teased if she failed again. Unfortunately, Dorothy would never be accepted as a writer for a profession. However, with this lack of success, Dorothy was viewed from the outside as a happy person. At 11 in the morning of December 12, 1910, Dorothy would make her way down the stairs of her family home to go tell her mother, Martha, that today she was going to go shopping to find a dress for her sister's party, which her name was Marjorie, which is scheduled on the 17th of that month. Martha was sick at that time, but she was willing to go with Dorothy. She told Dorothy that she wanted to come, but for some reason Dorothy said, "No, Mother, don't bother. You don't feel just right, and it's no use going to the trouble. I mightn't see the thing I want, but if I do, I'll phone you." When Dorothy left, she was carrying $25 of her $100 allowance. However, the day before, she withdrew $36 from the bank to be able to afford lunch for her friends at a restaurant called Sherry's. And she might have been carrying her nightgown, but she might have been hiding it in her muffs. After Dorothy left, she went to a candy store called Parks and Tilford's to purchase a half-pound of chocolates. Right after, Dorothy would make her way down the icy streets of New York City to 27th Street. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dorothy was standing outside talking to a friend named Gladys Kane outside Brentano's bookshop, which is located at 5th Avenue and 27th Street. However, after talking to her friend, she made her way to Central Park, and this would be the last time she would be seen. Gladys would say after talking to Dorothy, she seemed in a good and happy mood, and there seemed that there wasn't anything wrong with her. Dorothy was last seen wearing a well-tailored suit, a blue coat, a skirt, a black hat with roses for decoration, and a handbag. That night, when she didn't make it back for dinner without giving her family any warning, they got worried. They would make phone calls to Dorothy's close friends, but they hadn't seen her. However, one of Dorothy's friends, Elise Henry, who was called by the family, would call back after midnight. She would ask if Dorothy returned, and Miss Arnold would say yes, she's here. Elise would ask to speak to Dorothy, but Miss Arnold would say that she had a headache and went to bed. However, in reality, Dorothy wasn't there at all. It is still unknown why Miss Arnold lied about Dorothy making it back home. The next morning, when Dorothy still hadn't come home, Mr. Arnold called their lawyer and family friend John S. Keith. John would search Dorothy's room and found nothing out of the ordinary except there were some burnt papers in the fireplace. Dorothy didn't take anything that would help her run away or anything valuable from her room. When she went missing, Dorothy had a boyfriend who was 42-year-old George Grimson Jr., who was an engineer. They met at Bryn Mawr when Dorothy was attending. Dorothy's parents didn't support the relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Arnold didn't want George as a son-in-law because of the 17-year age gap, and also George seemed kinda lazy. A year before Dorothy went missing, she would lie to her parents by saying that she was going to see an old college friend. However, in reality, she went all the way to Boston to see George, and after Mr. and Mrs. Arnold realized what she was really doing, they forbade her from seeing George. The Arnolds suspected that George was in on Dorothy being missing. However, their theory was quickly disproved when they found out that George was in Italy when she went missing. On December 16th, 1910, the Arnolds sent a telegraph to George in Italy asking if he knew where Dorothy was, but he said that he had no idea where Dorothy was. However, George's answer didn't make them believe that he was innocent, so Miss Arnold and Dorothy's brother John flew out to Florence, Italy to go to the hotel that George was staying at. However, when they talked to George in person, he said that he loved Dorothy, but he didn't know where she went. Apparently, John wasn't having it that day because John KO'd George right in the jaw. Meanwhile, John Keith was back in New York City trying to figure out the case. Keith would search hospitals, morgues, and even shipports for Dorothy, but nothing came up. Keith needed more help, so I called George S. Doughty, who was the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who had started a private investigation. Still at this time, Mr. Arnold didn't call the police about his missing daughter because Mr. Arnold didn't want to make it known to the public for some reason. The investigation continued for 6 weeks, and finally, in mid-January of 1911, police were called, but even with the police helping, they still couldn't find anything. Police would suggest that the Arnolds have a press conference about Dorothy. So on January 25th, 1911, a press conference would be held at Mr. Arnold's office, and the Arnolds would hold a $1,000 reward if they found her, which would be over $32,000 in today's money. Dorothy's disappearance was all over the US and newspapers. There are thousands of tips or reports of sightings of Dorothy, which were all fake. During this time, when the case was all over America, the Arnold family received 2 ransom notes, demanding $5,000 to get Dorothy back, and also threatening Marjorie, Dorothy's sister. However, to this day, this case is still unsolved.
Just man at the top of my head so we can raise hallelujah.
On April 10th, 1928, two newlyweds, Glenn and Bessie Hyde, were going to their honeymoon that would be at the Grand Canyon. The two had met on a boat to Los Angeles in 1927. The two had an instant connection. When the two met, Bessie was married. However, the day before Glenn and Bessie got married, her divorce was finalized. The reason they chose the Grand Canyon was because Glenn wanted to set the record for the fastest time to go through the canyon, and if they completed the journey, it would make Bessie a celebrity because she'd be the first woman to complete the trail. On October 20th of that year, the two would start the first part of their journey on Glenn's scow that he made. A scow is basically a boat. They would start from Green River, Utah, with the goal of arriving at Needles, California by early December. After 26 days, the couple would make it to Bright Angel Trail, where they would go to visit photographer Emery Kolb. Emery would notice that the couple wasn't carrying life jackets on the boat, and he also said that their boat wasn't safe for the winter, and they should stay with him until the winter is over. Emery offered them life jackets, but Glenn would not only decline the life jackets, but he would also decline staying with Emery for the winter. Emery also noticed that Bessie seemed done with the trip and didn't want to go back out onto the water. On November 18th, still ignoring Emery's advice, the couple would go back onto the water. However, one of Emery's friends, Adolph G. Sutra, would travel with the couple for several miles until they reached Hermit Rapid, which is when Adolph would leave the couple. Adolph would be the last person to see the couple alive. On December 6th, Glenn's father was waiting for his son to return home from his almost 2-month-long journey. However, both Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be seen. Because of this, Glenn's father would report them missing, and 2 Army observation planes were sent out from Marchfield to Riverside, California to go look for the couple. On December 19th, the couple's boat was located on mile 237. The boat was sat upright, with supplies being strapped in place. Both Bessie and Glenn weren't on the boat. There also weren't any footprints on the boat either. Unfortunately, this case remained unsolved until 1971. On a commercial Grand Canyon trip, an older woman was one of the passengers. While she and the other passengers and guides were sitting around the campfire talking about the Hydes going missing, she said that she was Bessie Hyde. She continued talking, and the other passengers had mixed emotions. She said what really had happened was Glenn was abusive, and she had finally stabbed him, which could have been the real reason why she didn't want to go back out on the boat. She said after she stabbed him, she would flee the boat and would escape the canyon entirely. However, the woman's claims of Glenn being abusive is not a certain fact. Eventually, the woman's claim would change once officials found her. She basically played dumb and said she had no idea what they were talking about. In 1992, famous rafter Georgie Clark, who had passed away that year, was thought to be Bessie Hyde. There are some documents that she had which included a copy of Bessie and Glenn's marriage certificate. However, there weren't any evidence that she was in fact Bessie Hyde. Another big break would come in the case when in 1976, the skeletal remains of a young male would be found in the canyon. Theorists would jump to the conclusion that it was Glenn Hyde's remains. It also turns out that a bullet was found in the skull of the remains, which led to people thinking that both of them had been shot, and Emery Kolb had something to do with the murder. Even further proving this theory, it turns out there were skeletal remains on his property. However, this was disproved when the body turned out to be no older than 22 years old, while Glenn was 29 when he went missing. Also, the person who died would have died around or after 1972. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Etta Ryle was born on May 4th, 1914 in Providence, Rhode Island, to parents Joseph Ryle and Rose Ryle. Etta went to Oxford High School in Oxford, Massachusetts. While she was there, she met her boyfriend, Henry Solon. However, after they graduated, Etta would find out she was pregnant. Etta said that the baby's father belonged to Henry, and she would file a paternity suit against him. Etta was going to Worcester State Teachers College at the time, and Henry was going to Bates College in Maine, so the two weren't even in the same state. However, the two kept in contact. In September of 1934, Etta's daughter Alma was born. Fast forward to 2 months after Alma was born on November 21st, 1934. Etta was thinking about the paternity suit that was happening the next day. She seemed anxious and depressed about it until an evening that she spent with Henry on a drive in his car. After she got back from the drive, she seemed really happy because she said that she and Henry were getting married. She also told her sister that she was going up to New York City that night. Etta packed a small bag and wasn't bringing Alma along. However, she did say she would come back within the week for Alma. Sometime after midnight, a police officer saw Henry's car parked outside of Etta and her family's home. Etta would come out of her home and leave with Henry in his car. This would be the last time anyone would see Etta Ryle. Later that day on the 22nd, Etta's paternity suit was scheduled for that day. However, Etta was nowhere to be seen. That day, Eda's sister would run into Henry, and she would ask him why he and Eda decided to get married, and about the trip to New York City all of a sudden. Henry would say that he knew nothing about them getting married, and also he said he knew nothing about the New York City trip. Henry would say that he dropped off Eda at Worcester's Union Station in Worcester, Massachusetts. Henry didn't know where she went. Eda was reported missing, and police would go to Henry since he was the last person to see her. Henry would tell police that Eda falsely accused him of being the father of her child. Henry would also mention to police how Eda seemed apprehensive about the paternity suit. Henry thought that Eda may have been sued. A letter that Eda wrote to her friends would support this theory. From the research I did, I couldn't find anything about what the letter said. On December 2nd, Eda's attorney received a telegram that was signed by Eda. The letter would give directions to stop the paternity test against Henry. Police would look deeper into the telegram, and it turns out that it was ordered by a payphone in New York City, and to this day, the identity of this person remains unknown. Police would go to Worcester's Union Station, where Henry supposedly dropped off Eda at. It turns out the day of Eda's disappearance, the train dispatcher received 3 phone calls between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. from an unlisted number. 2 of the calls were from the same man, and the third call was from a woman. 2 people were saying that they wanted the staff to prevent Eda from getting on the train, and they wanted them to find her. On the third call, the woman calling said that she was the Oxford switchboard operator. However, it turns out the woman was lying because that night the switchboard operator that was on duty was male. To this day, the 2 people who made these calls remain unknown. A full search was done on the station, and Eda was nowhere to be seen. In 1935, the police started diving deeper into this case. They questioned more people about the case and connections to the case. One person that police interviewed was a man whose identity is unknown. He was from Putnam, Connecticut, and seemed close to Eda. He seemed even more suspicious because at the time of Eda's disappearance, he went to Florida with someone whose identity also remains unknown. However, he was ruled out. In August of that year, a woman said she had shared an apartment with Eda in Boston. However, the same woman was eventually moved to a psychiatric hospital, which means she was probably lying. There were many other incidents of people coming forward with information, however, they all didn't lead anywhere. In the years after the disappearance, police suspected that Eda was secretly buried at Oxford Cemetery. Graves were searched between 1935 and 1937, but her remains were never discovered. This case became famous across the U.S. The case was included in a New York City program called the War Radio Mystery Stories program. 56 years later, Eda's case was brought back to light when Alma, Eda's daughter, filed a paternity test against Henry. She said that she wanted Henry to be labeled as her legal father. However, in 1993, her case was dismissed. Unfortunately, Alma passed away in 2006, not knowing what happened to her mother. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Glenn Miller was born in Iowa on March 1st, 1904. He spent the later part of his childhood in Fort Morgan in Colorado. In high school, he played football and trombone, which he had a talent for. After graduating, he would attend the University of Colorado. However, he would eventually drop out to pursue a career in music. Luckily, his career in music would be successful. He had a hit called In the Mood that was released in 1939. During World War II, Glenn was traveling across Europe performing concerts for the soldiers. On December 15th, 1944, Glenn was finished performing for soldiers in England. He was going to board a plane to France with his orchestra. Glenn and 2 crew members would board an aircraft called the UC-64A Norseman on the same day. On December 18th, Glenn was nowhere to be seen and hadn't met up with his orchestra for rehearsals. However, the members of the orchestra weren't concerned. They thought that the weather conditions or the war delayed their arrival. On December 27th, Glenn had still not shown up and was reported missing. The investigation revealed that the plane never made it to France. Without any evidence in France, the investigation would move to England where Glenn was last seen. The police found out that 2 of the other crew members that Glenn traveled with were John Morgan and Norman F. Bassell. The day they left, the path that they were taking showed that there was heavy fog. It turns out that John wasn't even certified to fly, so it was concluded that John was having trouble seeing and the plane crashed into the English Channel. There have been many theories, even going as far as Glenn might have faked his death. However, to this day, the remains of the plane have not been found, and also Glenn hasn't been found. However, if you Google Glenn Miller, it says he passed away on December 15th, 1944. Lawrence Joseph Bader was born on December 2nd, 1926 in Akron, Ohio. His father was a dentist, and Joseph was inspired by his father and also wanted to become a dentist. However, instead, Joseph would join the Navy in 1944. After serving for 2 years, he would enroll in the University of Akron. While he was only there for 1 semester, he did meet his future wife, Mary Lou Knapp. They got married on April 19th, 1952. 5 years after the couple married, they already had 3 children and were expecting a 4th. On May 15th, 1957, Joseph was going on a business trip to Cleveland, Ohio. He told his wife that afterwards he was going to go on a fishing trip. Mary would ask if he was going to come straight home after the fishing trip, to which he would reply by saying, "Maybe I will and maybe I won't." After driving to Cleveland, he would pay off some bills and would cash in a $400 check. After this, he would travel to Ohio's Rocky River, which is off from Lake Erie. However, that day that Joseph was going fishing, he was told 2 times that a storm was coming. The first time was by the owner of a boathouse, who was Lawrence Coultalor, and the second time was a Coast Guard who saw him on the water. According to Lawrence, when Joseph was renting the boat, he had a suitcase with him. Joseph was renting a boat that came with lights. However, it wouldn't have been dark for a while at that time. Joseph would take the boat on the water, and the Coast Guard who saw him would be the last person to see Joseph. The storm would occur that day, and the next morning Joseph's boat was found 5 miles away. Joseph was nowhere to be seen, as along with his suitcase. However, the boat seemed fine with only a bent propeller and a scratch. The life jacket was on the boat still, and some reports state that the gas was empty or the gas line was completely disconnected. A search for Joseph was conducted for 2 months. However, he was declared dead in 1960. However, something strange would happen on either May 18th or May 20th of 1957. A guy who is described as being charming would walk into a bar in Omaha, Nebraska to request a job. He had a suitcase with him and a Navy-issued driver's license. He said that his name was John Fritz Johnson. John would say that he served for 14 years but was released after having a bad back. A lot of people took a liking to John, and he got a job as a bartender and became a local celebrity. He was very outgoing and had a passion for archery. He would also get married to Nancy Zimmer, who was a former model, which led to John adopting her daughter, and they would also have a child together. He would eventually do a fundraising event for charity. He would sit on a flagpole for 15 or 30 days to raise money for a virus called polio. He would eventually become a radio personality for the radio station called KBON. Eventually, on February 2nd, 1965, a 21-year-old named Suzanne Pica got a phone call telling her to come to a sporting goods show in Chicago. The caller was apparently an acquaintance to Lawrence, who was her uncle. She would eventually arrive at the show, which is where John was giving a demonstration about archery stuff. John was wearing an eye patch and had a mustache, but Suzanne would recognize him as her deceased uncle. After his presentation, Suzanne would go up to John and ask him, "Pardon me, but aren't you my uncle, Larry Bader, who disappeared 7 years ago?" John would laugh at the question, but she was convinced that he was Lawrence. Eventually, a finger comparison would be tested, and Lawrence and John were a match, which made John Fritz Johnson's real identity Lawrence Joseph Bader. According to John, he had no memory of his past of being Lawrence. This discovery led to John being held under 10 days of medical observation. The doctors couldn't find anything about him lying about this. However, there weren't any leads that doctors could find. On September 16th, 1966, John or Lawrence Joseph Bader would die of a tumor.
Why must I see shadows?
In January of 1966, a new Prime Minister would be elected for Australia. This new Prime Minister would replace the loyal and the country's longest-serving leader, John Warhurst. His name was Harold Holt, and while not being in office for a while, he made changes, like changing the money currency to dollars and cents. On December 17th, 1967, it was a nice day to go swimming. Before lunch, Holt was going to the beach near his holiday home at Portsea on the Victorian coast. Holt did enjoy swimming, however he wasn't the strongest swimmer. He also wasn't in the best health after just having shoulder surgery. The doctor said not to do some crazy shit like swimming, which is what he was going to do. He also played tennis recently after the surgery, which is stupid. The day when Holt went missing, the tide was high, and some people even said it was the highest they had seen it. Despite this, Holt swam further into the water, which is stupid. Before Holt went into the water, he told the group that he was with that, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." However, after going into the water, he was never seen again. He was reported missing, and the country of Australia was shocked about their Prime Minister being missing. The search was massive. There were about 300 people looking for Holt, but eventually, on January 5th, 1968, the search was called off. The only thing left behind him on that beach was just a pile of his clothes. Most people think that he had just drowned, and his body will most likely never be found. To this day, this case remains unsolved.